everyone. Welcome back.
Yeah, great to be here.
So today we're going to be diving into some really heavy stuff.
Yeah.
We're talking about the erosion of democratic institutions in the U.S. over the past few decades.
Right. And
It's a lot.
It's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, it's a lot. It can feel kind of overwhelming to even think about.
But absolutely.
We're going to try to break it down and make it as digestible as possible and hopefully have some, aha moments along the way.
Exactly. I think, one of the goals here is to trace how we got to this point.
Yeah.
And it is a fascinating and concerning journey.
Speaking of concerning, did you know that there's actually a blueprint for a potential authoritarian takeover called Project 2025?
Yeah, and this isn't some fringe conspiracy theory.
Right.
This is a plan that was crafted by a prominent conservative think tank. And it's already in motion.
Yeah. So before we get to that, let's kind of rewind a bit. Give us the historical context. When did things start to go off the rails?
Well, to really understand this, we need to go back to the 1970s, believe it or not.
Okay.
The post-Watergate era was a time of strengthening democratic reforms.
So this was like a high point for actual good governance.
Yeah. You had stricter campaign finance laws.
Okay.
The Voting Rights Act got some teeth.
Wow.
Congress was actually pushing back against presidential power.
It's hard to imagine that now.
Right.
With all the gridlock and all the...
Yeah, it's a totally different landscape.
So when did that tide turn?
Well, the shift really started in the 80s and 90s with the Reagan administration's focus on deregulation and the appointment of more conservative judges.
Oh, so this is when big business started to...
Exactly. This is when corporations started to have a much bigger say in politics.
Okay.
And money started to really flow into the system.
Yeah, this is the classic money in politics problem.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And there's this pivotal moment that we have to talk about.
Yeah.
The Supreme Court's decision in Buckley v. Valeo back in 1976.
Buckley versus Valeo.
Yeah, and this is the case that essentially said money equals free speech, and that set the stage for wealthy donors to wield massive influence.
Which kind of exploded after Citizens United in 2010.
Oh yeah, things went into overdrive after Citizens United.
Yeah, that's when we got all these super PACs we all know and love.
Right, exactly.
So, just to connect this back to you listening right now, think about it this way. Corporations can now spend unlimited amounts to back the candidates that they want.
Yeah.
Potentially drowning out your voice at the ballot box.
That's right. And it creates this very uneven playing field.
Right. It's not exactly fair, is it?
Not at all. Mm-hmm. And alongside this growing influence of money, we also see this disturbing trend of laws targeting voting rights.
Yeah.
And attempts to silence dissent.
It's crazy how many laws have popped up trying to make it harder to vote.
Yeah.
Especially for marginalized communities.
Yeah, it's a very targeted effort.
And criminalizing protests.
Exactly.
It's like they're trying to shut down any kind of pushback.
Exactly. Since 2017, at least 21 states have passed nearly 50 laws restricting protests.
Wow.
Some increased penalties for blocking traffic, which, on the surface,
right,
sounds kind of reasonable.
It's reasonable, yeah.
But others go as far as holding organizations liable for,
oh wow,
quote, conspiring to protest.
So you can't even organize.
It's this really chilling effect on free speech.
It's like a pre-crime.
Right, exactly.
They're trying to...
It's getting ahead of it and just preventing it from happening in the first place.
Yeah. Remember Florida's anti-riot law a couple of years ago?
Oh yeah, I remember that one.
That one basically encouraged drivers to run over protesters blocking roads.
Yeah, that was a very controversial law.
I mean, parts of it were blocked by courts.
Yeah.
But the intent was pretty clear as intimidate people into silence.
Absolutely, and that raises this huge question, right?
Yeah.
If protesting becomes too risky, how can ordinary citizens hold those in power accountable?
That's like a cornerstone of...
It's a fundamental principle of a functioning democracy.
And on the topic of accountability, let's talk about the role of the courts, especially the Supreme Court.
Big one.
Have they been helping or hindering this democratic backslide?
Sadly, they've played a significant role in accelerating the erosion.
Oh, wow.
We already talked about Citizens United, which blew open the doors for corporate spending.
Right.
But there's also Shelby County v. Holder from 2013.
Shelby County versus Holder.
That decision gutted a key part of the Voting Rights Act,
okay,
making it much easier for states with a history of discrimination to pass laws that suppress voting.
So this is targeted at...
particularly among minority groups.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that was a huge setback for voting rights.
And then there's Rucho v. Common Cause from 2019.
Oh, yeah, that's another big one.
Where they basically said, thumbs up to partisan gerrymandering.
Yeah, the Supreme Court basically said it's not a matter for federal courts to decide.
Which is pretty wild considering how much it warps our elections.
Right. It allows politicians to draw district lines to guarantee their party wins, regardless of what the voters actually want.
Yeah, it's minority rule masquerading as democracy.
It really is.
Yeah.
And here's a crazy thing to think about.
Yeah.
A majority of current Supreme Court justices were appointed by presidents who didn't even win the popular vote.
Wow. So the system
seems rigged to favor a particular ideology.
Yeah. It makes you wonder if your vote even mattered as much as, say, a billionaire donors.
That's a very valid concern. It is.
Yeah.
It really is a valid concern. And speaking of rigged systems, we can't ignore the executive branch and this idea of the Unitary Executive Theory.
Okay. So break that down for me. What is this theory? And how does it fit into this whole erosion of democracy thing we're talking about?
Sure. So in a nutshell, the Unitary Executive Theory argues that the president has almost unchecked authority over the entire executive branch, meaning they can basically tell agencies what to do with very little oversight from Congress or the courts.
So it's like, I'm the president, I call the shots, no one can question me kind of thing.
That's a simplified way to put it. But yeah, essentially,
Okay.
It's a pretty expansive view of presidential power, and it's been gaining traction for decades.
And I'm guessing the Trump administration really put this theory to the test.
Oh yeah, big time.
What were some examples of that?
Well, they constantly push the boundaries of executive power. They attack the FBI, the Justice Department. They even tried to bypass Congress using claims of emergency powers.
Remember when he wanted to build the border wall?
Exactly. That was a prime example. He wanted to do it without congressional approval.
And wasn't there something about Trump wanting to fire a bunch of career government employees?
Yes, that's right. It was called Schedule F, an executive order that would have allowed him to fire thousands of civil servants and replace them with political appointees.
Oh, wow. So basically gutting the expertise of the federal government.
Essentially, yeah. Replacing it with loyalty.
That sounds terrifying.
It is a frightening thought, and it really shows how fragile our institutions can be. Now, Schedule F wasn't fully implemented, but the fact that it was even considered is a huge red flag.
Yeah, it's setting a precedent.
Exactly. It lays the groundwork for future presidents to potentially revive it.
So all the chaos and power grabs we saw during Trump's presidency weren't just random acts. They were part of a deliberate strategy.
Right. It was all very intentional and calculated.
To weaken checks and balances.
Exactly. And this brings us back to Project 2025 because it essentially formalizes these trends into a concrete plan.
Right. So we've got these billionaires with questionable views on democracy, a media landscape that's more like a minefield of misinformation, and a political climate where the rule of law seems optional.
It's a pretty bleak picture.
Where do individuals like Peter Thiel and Elon Musk fit into all of this?
Well, they're key players, for sure. Peter Thiel, the tech investor, has openly expressed doubts about democracy. He famously said, "I no longer believe that freedom and democracy are compatible."
Wow.
And he's putting his money where his mouth is funding. Things like seasteading, basically creating independent floating cities outside the reach of any government.
So he wants to just escape democracy.
It seems that way. He wants to build his own libertarian paradise.
It sounds like a plot from a sci-fi novel.
Right. And his influence extends to the political sphere as well. He's backed candidates like J.D. Vance and Blake Masters who share his skepticism about democracy. He was a major supporter of Donald Trump.
It's like he's actively trying to dismantle the system from within.
Yeah. And then you have Elon Musk, who, after taking over Twitter, turned it into, X.
Right.
And the impact of that takeover on our information ecosystem is huge. Musk claimed to be a champion of free speech, but what he really did was dismantle Twitter's safeguards against misinformation and hate speech.
So he made it a breeding ground for conspiracy theories, basically.
Pretty much. He let previously banned accounts back on fired content moderators and even went after journalists who criticized him.
So under his leadership, Twitter became a megaphone for the voices trying to undermine democracy.
And ironically, all in the name of free speech.
Right.
To make matters worse, Musk himself has spread false and misleading information, especially about elections.
So he's not even practicing what he preaches.
Exactly. His actions have made it much harder to tell truth from fiction online, and that has very real consequences in the real world.
It's crazy how much power these individuals have to shape the information we consume.
It is a lot of power concentrated in very few hands.
And speaking of shaping narratives, we can't forget about Trump himself. He's like a walking, talking embodiment of democratic erosion.
Oh, absolutely. Trump consistently attacked the judiciary, the media, He even suggested the U.S. should try president for life.
Wow.
Not to mention his threats to use the military to crush protests. His actions normalize a level of disrespect for democratic norms that is incredibly dangerous.
And he surrounded himself with people who enabled those tendencies.
Right, like Stephen Miller, the architect of some of the most inhumane immigration policies in recent history.
It's like they were trying to redefine what it means to be American.
Exactly. Excluding anyone who doesn't fit their narrow, often bigoted worldview.
Which brings us back to Project 2025. It's not just some abstract theory, it's a concrete roadmap for implementing these extreme and often anti-democratic ideas.
Precisely. It takes all the threads we've been discussing, the erosion of norms, the concentration of power, the rise of extremist figures, and weaves them into a blueprint for a potential authoritarian takeover.
Okay, so enough doom and gloom. What can we, the everyday people, actually do about this? It feels like such a massive problem.
It's a huge challenge, but the good news is that awareness of this threat is growing. More people are starting to understand the dangers posed by Project 2025 and similar efforts. But awareness alone isn't enough.
So what actions can we take? Where do we even begin to push back against this tide?
Well, for starters, I think we need to support the organizations that are fighting to protect voting rights and hold those in power accountable.
Yeah.
Groups like the ACLU,
Right.
the Brennan Center for Justice Common Cause.
Those are good ones. Yeah.
They're on the front lines of this battle.
Yeah. And I think donating to those organizations or volunteering our time can really make a difference.
Absolutely. And speaking of being proactive, we need to be vigilant about calling out misinformation and disinformation wherever we see it.
Especially on social media.
Especially on social media.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can't just passively scroll by when we see something that's blatantly false or misleading. We need to challenge it, report, help others understand how to spot these tactics.
Yeah, it's like this constant game of whack-a-mole, but it's so important.
It is. We can't let the truth get drowned out in a sea of lies.
Right. And beyond that, I think we need to support quality journalism.
Oh, that's crucial.
The media plays such a huge role in shaping public perception.
Absolutely.
And unfortunately, they often contribute to the problem without even realizing it.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to unpack.
So explain that a bit more. How is the media complicit in all this?
Well, there are two key things I want to highlight.
Okay.
First, the way they cover protests, especially those led by marginalized communities. And second, this phenomenon called sane washing, where they basically make extremist rhetoric and policies sound more palatable to the public.
Okay, sane washing.
Yeah.
Interesting term.
So it's like they're putting lipstick on a pig. Right?
Yeah, right. Making something ugly look presentable.
Exactly. Yeah. We saw this happen constantly with the coverage of Donald Trump and the Magie movement.
Right.
In an effort to appear balanced or to avoid accusations of bias.
Right. The whole both sides thing.
Exactly. Many media outlets ended up sanitizing Trump's rhetoric and downplaying his most extreme and dangerous statements.
So they were like selectively quoting him.
Yeah.
Highlighting the parts that sounded, somewhat reasonable while leaving out the crazy, offensive, or outright false stuff.
Precisely. And that creates a distorted picture for the public.
Right.
People might not fully grasp how radical and dangerous Trump's ideas actually are, because the media is presenting this cleaned up version of him.
It's like they're unintentionally doing PR for him.
Exactly. And this sane washing goes beyond just Trump.
Okay.
It applies to policies too.
Right.
We see these radical right-wing proposals framed in this neutral technocratic language, making them seem less threatening than they really are.
Like Project 2025, for example. I bet some outlets would describe it as a bold plan to reform government without ever acknowledging its deeply anti-democratic nature.
That's exactly what we've seen, and it's incredibly dangerous.
It's really scary.
It lulls people into a false sense of security, making them less likely to recognize and resist these authoritarian threats.
Yeah. It's like the media is normalizing the abnormal.
Right. And on the flip side, we have the suppression or misrepresentation of protest movements.
Oh, yeah.
Think about the coverage of the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020.
Right.
Many outlets focused heavily on instances of looting or violence, even though the vast majority of the protests were peaceful.
Right. It was like they were trying to portray the protesters as the problem.
Exactly.
Rather than focusing on the systemic issues of, racism and police brutality that they were protesting against.
Right. And this kind of framing makes it easier for authorities to crack down on protests and justify the use of force.
Right.
It also makes it harder for those movements to gain public support if people only see the negative sensationalized images.
Yeah, it's a double standard for sure.
Absolutely.
Like, we tend to see protests as heroic when they happen in other countries, but when they happen here at home, they're often portrayed as disruptive and dangerous.
Yeah, and that speaks volumes about how we view dissent. We're more comfortable with it when it's directed at the other, but less so when it challenges the power structures within our own society.
So with all this media manipulation, how can we even know what to believe anymore?
It's a challenge.
It feels like we're drowning in a sea of misinformation.
It is.
Yeah.
But the first step is to be aware of these biases.
Okay.
We can't just passively consume information. We need to question narratives, seek out diverse sources, and be wary of anyone claiming to have a monopoly on the truth.
So basically become our own fact checkers.
Exactly. And beyond that, we need to support independent journalism and media outlets that are committed to truth-telling and holding power accountable.
Right.
Because without a free and independent press, democracy is in serious trouble.
Well, this has been a whirlwind of information.
Yeah.
It's a lot to digest, but I think it's crucial that we have these conversations.
I agree. We can't afford to be complacent. The erosion of democratic norms is happening all around us, and it's up to each of us to understand the threat and take action.
So to everyone listening out there, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into a pretty heavy topic. We hope it's been informative and thought-provoking, but more importantly, we hope it sparked a sense of urgency.
Yeah, because the future of American democracy depends on an engaged and informed citizenry. It's up to all of us to protect the values of freedom, equality, and justice that are under attack.
So stay informed, stay engaged, and stay hopeful. We can do this.